Hello, and welcome back to Life, the Universe, and Everything. We'll go ahead and turn it over now to our panel, which is the adult books of Roald Dahl. I've got the wrong title on there. We'll get that fixed. The adult books of Roald Dahl, featuring our panelists Richie Franklin, Jessica DeGeorge, and Natalie Brianne. Go ahead and turn it over to you guys. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. I apologize. I don't know that gentleman's
Richie,
voice.
we can't hear you.
Oh, am I muted?
I can't hear you.
I can hear you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Him? Oh, I can't hear. I can hear you, but not him.
Oh, odd.
Oh, hold on.
That's weird.
Let's see here.
I have to play telephone.
Can you hear me now?
Natalie, would you tell Richard that
Yes, I can hear you too. Can you hear me now?
I can't hear you. That is super, super odd.
Let's try. Is that better? Can you hear me now?
I'll hear you.
This was going to be seamless. Can you hear me?
I don't know how to see the chat either. Is it just me?
No, we can hear you. I hear you okay.
It's
All right.
okay.
We're good on the broadcast.
Well,
Well,
I'll go ahead and relay
Tell
the
me what Richard
questions.
says.
I will relay the questions. I will repeat.
Yeah, I
them.
was about to say,
Super
maybe
funny.
Natalie, you can interpret for us.
I
I
would
would
love
go and then
to.
it just went dead silent.
Is this better? Maybe not.
Is there an easy chat box? I don't know how to work
That's a
this.
good question.
I hate it.
Well, Natalie, we'll just have you relay the question.
Sounds
Technically,
good.
I'm moderating here. If I was better at sign language, I would say, thank you. We'll be talking, but I'm not really good at sign language, at least.
So I'm going to relay the questions. He would use sign
Thank you.
language, but I don't think that.
I can't. I
Yeah.
don't know any.
Well, I'll kick us off here, and I'll do some introductions real quick, and then I'll turn the microphone over to you first, Natalie, and then you can swing it over to Jessica. And
Introduce
just to do
first,
some,
and then turn the mic over to me, and then over to you. I'll start putting it in
Yes.
the check-in chat. How's that?
I don't know where that is, so I don't know.
Okay. Well,
okay. Let's see. I can try one more thing here, Jessica. Whoop. Got a headset. We'll see if that fixes it. Is that better? Can you hear me?
I don't think Jessica can.
I don't think
I
Jessica
can't
can
hear
me.
anything but you, Natalie, now. I don't know if anyone else is talking.
Or if this maybe fixes it, I don't know. Nothing? Let's see.
Well, that's ridiculous. Should I go out and come back in, but I don't know how to do that? I don't know.
I don't know.
I think we can try and relay the questions and keep on
Okay,
trying
if you just want to.
things.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So welcome everyone out there. I'm very, very delighted to be here today with Natalie Brianne and Jessica DeGeorge to talk about the adult books of Roald Dahl. I've been very excited about this, and I'm gonna give most of the time over to Natalie and Jessica to discuss the books. But I love this topic. I actually met Roald Dahl. That dates me a little bit. But I met him when I was a kid. He came to my elementary school and spoke to us. And so I'm going to just turn it over to you, Natalie, to introduce yourself and tell us what the first Roald Dahl book you fell in love with was. And if it was Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where did you go to from there?
Well, first of all, that's absolutely fantastic that you met Roald Dahl. That's insane. I can't remember the first Roald Dahl book that I read. I just remember that I absolutely ate them up. I would go to the library and get as many of them as possible to read them. And so, like, I've read almost probably all of his children's books. And probably my favorite one of his children's books is Danny the Champion of the World. In fact, when people ask me what my favorite book is, to this day, that's probably because I don't have a favorite book, but like if someone says your favorite book right now, I'm like Danny the Champion of the World, just because it has such nostalgic feelings for me. So I love Roald Dahl. I like his way with words and the whimsy is just fantastic. So the question was introduce yourself and how you first were introduced to Roald Dahl and where you went from there.
Okay. So, well, introducing myself real quick, I'm Jessica Day George, who apparently can't hear the moderator. That's super weird. But anyway, I'm the author of 16 fantasy books for young adults and middle grade readers. And the most recent is Writer's Reign, which came out at the height of lockdown. We shall know more of it last summer. But I'm a huge Roald Dahl fan. And it actually, was aware of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, but did not read it until much later. But in second grade at the book fair, I picked up this because I loved the cover so much. You do judge books by their cover. That's why they have nice covers. And I was just in love. Everything about this book is just, if you have not read the BFG, The Big Friendly Giant, please do. It is delightful. And this is still my copy.
Okay, thank you.
What? And then my teacher that same year in second grade read us The Fantastic Mr. Fox. And just the movie is phenomenal and is one of my favorite movies, but the book is just so great. And I remember it so clearly, everything about it and the illustrations and stuff. I don't know where this copy came from, but it looks exactly like the one my teacher had, and it appeared in our house a few years ago, and I have no idea, but isn't that nice? It's like just here. But at our library when I was in later in high school, it was very small, the Madison County Library in Idaho, and they would have like one or two books of a series and not others. Like they didn't have Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, but they had The Great Glass Elevator. So I read that, and they had in the children's section The Wonderful Story of Henry Sugar and Six More, which I would argue is not for children. And there is a story in there that I cannot find the title of. I cannot remember it. I don't have a copy of that exact book. And it has stayed with me forever and ever. And I used to check that book out all the time just for that story about a guy who at his club, his gentleman's club, there is a very large fat man who keeps making hints about, I know your secret. And what it is that his grandma was Indian and she was kind of like a wise woman or something. And he's like, I know you have some of your grandma's powers and I want you to help me lose this weight. So the guy gives him a spell to help him lose weight, not fat, weight, because that's what he asked for. It is not for children, and it is absolutely phenomenal. And this guy loses weight, not fat. And it's absolutely pointing out the racism too in these gentlemen's clubs, that this guy keeps sidling up and basically implying, I'm going to tell everyone why you look so tan all the time unless you help me. Like, because they'll kick you out because you're like a quarter Indian. So great. Love it. So that's me. That's my love affair with Roald Dahl, how it started.
Is it SEO Trot?
SEO Trot? I don't think that's the story. Oh, she's gone. I don't think that's the story she's talking about, because SEO Trot is about a man who's wooing a woman by making her tortoise grow bigger and smaller as it would go.
I can hear you.
Oh,
yes, all right, we're here.
They took me out and then put me back in. Oh my gosh.
That you can hear me now.
I can hear you.
Brilliant.
Nobody move. Like, don't touch anything.
This is wonderful. Yes, thank you.
Everything's great.
Thank you.
That's great.
ASEO Trot. I discovered that when my oldest was switching from like picture books, you know, early chapter books to real books, we were having a hard time finding something he liked. And I bought him the whole box set from Costco of the Roald Dahl box set. And I had not heard of a couple of them. And one of them's Easy-O-Trot, however you say it. And so he read that aloud to me. And we were both just so delighted. We're like, this is just charming. It's such an anomaly, too. I was thinking about that the other day, though. It's about adults. I mean, there's a kid in the book that is helping this guy with but it's geriatric love. I mean, it's like these people are both like almost past middle age, and they apparently made a movie of it a few years ago, but it's like a little, I haven't been able to see it. It's like Dustin Hoffman and Meryl Streep or something like that,
And Judi Dench, I think.
Lovely.
Judi Dench, yes. And
Madam Judi Dench.
I was thinking the other day about how many kids books that we grew up with, these kids books that are basically about adults, and maybe there's a child perspective in there, or they're helping the kids. And nowadays, like, as someone who writes middle grade, that absolutely does not fly. If the main characters are adults, or if the adults are the ones that save the day or pose the problem, basically, and it's an adult book. And I think that's so interesting, because as kids, we didn't question that. We just were cheering for these 60-year-olds to find love with their tortoises.
So talk to us a little bit about that. And Natalie, of course, you can step into that, but there has been a shift. I mean, a lot of Roald Dahl's children's books it is a child, and then there are these villainous adults, right? But these books, there's
a lot of that. There's a lot.
Yeah. But
usually the grown-ups are the bad guys. so
although
there
are always good, like, adults in those novels that are good guys. Like, their parents are often there in some capacity too, which is odd for middle grade and YA nowadays too. Anyway, continue your question.
Yeah, we tend to have to kill the parents because the parents wouldn't let you do these things.
Of course not.
They wouldn't let you go into a dragon's cave or hang out with your 60-year-old lonely neighbor, or, like, you know. So I do think it's an interesting shift, and I do think he's kind of in the middle then that way, because there are usually the ones of his books that are packages for children generally tend to have Danny, the champion of the world, although so much of that book is his father and his relationship with his father, but that still holds water as a modern, you could still do that in a modern, in a modern middle grade novel. You could still have a book about a boy and his father. And so many books, I was looking at this list of Newbery winners from back in the day, and they were talking about, somebody was basically pointing out the fact that there are several of those Newbery winners that are like best books for children that don't have any children in them at all. The Pushcart War that continues to be super popular is about, like, men fighting on the streets of Brooklyn, over their, like, their push carts that they sell vegetables from and stuff. It's this whole thing. Nothing to do with kids at all. There's no kids involved in the book at all. So many of the books were like that. And Roald Dahl was kind of one of the first people to really say, like, and he never said really that he was writing for children, but he was kind of one of the first to say, to stick to his guns. I've seen interviews with him where they're like, well, why'd you make a child the main character and stuff like that? And he's like, because why not? Children are interesting and they have these experiences too. And he was kind of one of the pioneers of saying kids' books should have kids in them, or, like, kids are interesting enough to hold a book together. Like, he got a lot of flack over Matilda, and he's like, but why? Like, what was the one that, but if you have read Boy, which is stories from his own childhood, I love Boy and Going Solo, his nonfiction. Although I look at it and go, really? This is all nonfiction? Really? But so many of his books are based on things that he did as a child. He was a little stinker, and there was the old lady that ran the candy shop down the street.
And the mouse.
And they put a dead mouse in one of the candy jars, and then they think they gave her a heart attack because the shop wasn't open the next day or something like that. So he's like a 10-year-old assuming he's murdered this old woman, and he doesn't really feel sorry about it because she was really awful. And, like, so it's really kind of interesting how he put and freely admitted of how much that he put into his books. and aim those at kids, because that wasn't really a thing that people did unless they were kind of moralizing at the children. You know, there's obviously one or two outliers that are still popular today, Narnia and Wizard of Oz and things like that, but there are just floods and floods of books that the books that were aimed for kids were like, you were mean to that old lady and now you must pay. Like, you know.
Yeah, that's a great point. That brings up an interesting thing. If I recall correctly, Roald Dahl was raised in boarding schools and felt like he, as a youth, had some of these difficult experiences, like you were talking about, Jessica. So, how do we draw on our own childhood experiences, and what if we had a good childhood experience, or we?
That's why I write fantasy. Nobody cares about growing up. Like, my parents are still very much in love. Like, my siblings and I are all very close. None of them's an evil wizard. I mean, it's just like, it's so blah. You just can't even handle it. He did have such a rich background, and I love that when people can turn it into something. Some of it could have been very traumatic, but he saw the humor in it, and I think that's really why his stories are lasting and why he was successful to begin with. Because his dad was a one-armed train baron. Like, his dad had his arm ripped off in like an accident. And when he talks about it, he just talks about how cool his dad was, you know, like his dad invented a spork basically with a sharpened edge so that he could just eat totally one-handed. He had like a fork with a heavy bowl that he could almost eat soup with. And then like it had he sharpened the edge of it so he could cut his meat and eat it with like the same thing, because his dad had his arm ripped off in a train accident and he was just like, c'est la vie, but he invented a cool utensil for it, you know. And his dad died when he was quite young. He was sent to boarding schools. The boarding school experience sounds horrible, but he talks about it so funny, and I really think that is what gives it such lasting power and is such an inspiration as a writer to look at. Like I, you know, I may have had bad things happen to me, and I could either just sit here going like, oh, woe is me, this was so awful, let me give you my nonfiction tale of my woes. Or I could go, you know, that guy really did look like a Muppet, and I should maybe write it like this. I had a friend who had bright blue curly hair in school, and our one really horrible teacher used to call him the Muppet. And I just think all the time, like, if I wanted to turn that around, I could talk about how I had this really horrible, like, bullying teacher, or I could talk about how my friend accidentally turned into a Muppet one time in class because they wouldn't stop calling him that, you know. And it just depends on how you look at it. And I think he really looked at things from a very different perspective. He was almost killed several times during World War II, and he talks about it in Going Solo, how close they came, literally standing, having planes strafe on each side of them as they stood in the middle of this field, and just standing really still until it passed, and then jumping in their own plane and going after him. And he is hilarious about it. Like, he's not like, and that's when I ran away and hid until the war was over. No, he's like, I jumped in my plane, it was awesome. And he was so tall, his knees were up by his ears when he was crammed in his little plane cockpit, and he couldn't move, and he could only take like one change of socks and underpants with him because there was no more room in the cockpit for everything else. And he talks about it, and you're laughing, and then you're thinking later, like, that's really horrifying. Like,
so Roald Dahl.
Oh,
go ahead, Natalie. No, go.
So relatable because, like, when bad things happen in your life, like when right after it, generally you can't laugh about it, but like a couple years down the line, you tell stories about it and you laugh about it because it's part of coping and part of healing from those experiences. And I mean, for instance, with his experience in boarding school, I'm sure that he had some really bad experiences with adults that he was able to then write into his stories where, I mean, everyone can kind of relate to, I mean, when you're a child, you can see things from a different perspective where it's like, okay, well, this teacher is absolutely awful because of one or two bad things that happened. And it's just because as a child, you feel a lot of emotions. And so sometimes things really, I don't know.
And you don't know,
stick
and
with
this person has power over you,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, and it's harder for you to fathom that this will be over one day or something like that, or to understand why they're like that. Like, you know, just I had a principal at my one elementary school that the whole elementary school, it was like going underground. Like everything was brown, the ceiling, the walls, the carpet. He always wore brown suits. And I just remember just this heavy feeling and so depressed. And I got sent to his office all the time for just the randomest things. There were 7 girls in my grade named Jessica at the time, because it was like the world's most popular name. And like this one teacher would just send everyone within earshot named Jessica to the principal's office if Jessica did something wrong and stuff. And I just remember just feeling so down and so heavy. And a few years ago, I went and spoke at that school, and it looked totally different inside. And I'm like, I have such terrible memories of this, and everything's brown. And I was telling the librarian, and she started laughing. She's like, oh, you were here with Mr. Olson? And I'm like, yeah, he was the principal. She's like, so he was colorblind? And he was the first principal when they were building the school. So he just picked everything to match because he didn't want to tell anyone that he was colorblind. And so literally he picked the carpet and the walls and the ceiling to be the exact tint that he saw on his suit every day. So my memories of being underground just in this big brown tunnel are accurate and now very hilarious to me. Like at the time, I'm like, this is so depressing. I can hardly bring myself to go to school. And now I'm dying. I'm dying to put that in a book. I'm dying to put that in a book because I would be like, why is this like this? And I would doubt my own mind, like, was I really remembering it that way? And now, they've changed it around. They've taken out the carpet. It's all bright and cheery. And I'm like, I remember being so depressed. Oh no, it really was like that. And it's all because this one guy had this thing.
It sounds like a Roald Dahl book.
It does.
He talks in Boy or Going Solo about being a bog warmer, and it's absolutely my favorite thing, and I just have to bring it out now talking about schools. But the bog, like the toilets, like the older boys would send their, what do they call them? Not gophers, but basically like a grunt. Like you had a kid, like a little kid that the upperclassmen could order around, like, go bring me my lunch, carry my books for me. And he had a guy, his very first year, they used to demand that he go sit on the toilet for him before he went in because they were unheated. And the toilets. And so he would send him every morning to go sit for like half an hour to an hour on the toilet so that it was warm from Roald's bottom before this upperclassman came in to use it in the morning after breakfast. And he said he read the complete works of Dickens his first year at boarding school sitting on the bogs for this guy. Goodness. And he said he was like the best bog warm. Instead of being like, it was awful and I was oppressed, he's like, I read the complete works of Dickens. They're still my favorites to this day. And I was such a good bog warmer that when this guy graduated, he passed me on to his younger brother. And I was like he was known for
generational
skills. And I just think, it's the kind of thing that almost no one would believe. But it happened. It's so weird. It has to have happened, and it's the kind of thing too that you could take one of two ways. You could be like trying to escape or writing later to, telling your therapist later about how this is where my phobia of bathrooms came from or something. Or you could turn it around and write this hilarious story about it and talk about how that's how I discovered Charles Dickens. It really is, his outlook is so interesting.
Well, and his ability to take those kind of things, like you said about perspective earlier, right? To take the perspective of some of these negative things, because there's horrible things that happen to these children in some of his books, and yet it turns out to be, I don't want to say charming necessarily, but it becomes endearing. How do you take that whimsical kind of approach, right? Like a supreme bog warmer, and turn that into something that is appealing for others to read, because he's not necessarily he's positive about it, but it isn't necessarily, there's this happy story about how much I love sitting on the bog. It's I'm maltreated, but look at this wonderful, I got to read Dickens on there. So how do you take that?
It's not a happy story, but it has a happy ending. And I was just thinking about that in my head, that the difference between a lot of his adult short stories, which are borderline horror, many of them, and his children's stories all have a happy ending. Charlie, they're underdog stories, and I was talking about this in the last panel, just like, because it's my, like, I don't know what you want, my motto in life. I'm going to embroider on a sampler or something. Everybody loves an underdog story. Everybody loves a Cinderella story. You could be, you know, the most spoiled, like everything handed to you on a platter. In fact, it's worse for you if you are, like, you know, and you still will feel oppressed about something. You could grow up like I did, like, you know, happy family, you know, spoiled youngest daughter, you know, the only redhead, so grandma's clear favorite, you know, because she was a redhead, you know, stuff like that. Oh, I found things that just, oh, my life is, I am like Annie in the orphanage, you know, I have to vacuum this one room of our beautiful home, you know, that kind of thing. Like every human being finds that type of thing. So you love an underdog story, a Cinderella story, because you have felt like an underdog. You felt like a Cinderella at some point in your life. Every person has. In fact, if you're the, you know, spoiled person and stuff, the least little thing that goes wrong is going to hit you that much harder even. And you're going to be like, oh, woe is me. My pony is sick today, you know, and now I have to console myself by going on my yacht for the afternoon instead of riding one of my ponies, like that kind of thing. You're going to feel like the underdog at some point in your life. And so you're going to love reading a story about an underdog that wins. Cinderella goes to the ball and marries the prince. The miller's son in Puss in Boots, the youngest son inherits nothing but the cat and then ends up, you know, married to the king's daughter and living in this fabulous palace because it happens to be a magic cat. Like, it's such a popular story. And so every one of his stories, Matilda, the parents are awful, the school is awful, her brother, everything is awful. She discovers she has a magic power, has all these adventures with it, and then ends up being adopted by a better person and living out her life in safety and comfort in this beautiful house. You know, all of it. Charlie, their house is so horrible and they're eating cabbage water for dinner and they've got 4 grandparents crammed into one bed and stuff like that. And he inherits this amazing chocolate factory and he's rich and surrounded by candy for the rest of his life. You know, all of his stories sort of end that way. Danny, the champion of the world, happy endings left and right. You know, dad does not go to prison for the pheasants. It's my favorite.
And just the image of the pheasants, just all.
The one,
I
if you
love
don't know,
that
Danny,
image.
the champion of the world is not fantasy, and it's a story about poaching. And
which is why it's so odd that it's my favorite novel. Like, I have nothing to do with England or poaching or anything like that, but I love it.
That doesn't matter. Like, I know so many people that read that when they were younger, and it just left such an impression. But there's an image of like all these previously drugged pheasants coming along and exploding out of a pram. So coming out of the baby buggy, instead of the baby, it was full of dead pheasants, and they all whoom, and just, it's so funny. And you know, Danny and his dad have a happy ending. Like, all of his stories have a happy ending that are intended for kids. So no matter what the kids go through, and some of them go through very, I mean, the Dickens influence is quite clear. There's very Dickensian elements, especially Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. That's absolute 100% Dickens, down to the factory, you know, like, but it ends on a happy note. There's only bad people die or are permanently punished. You know, the BFG, little Sophie, gets to live out her days in comfort and meet the queen, and all these things happen because they are good. And so it's, in a way, it is very moralizing because, you know, goodness, cleanliness is thinness is, I've seen him criticized, which it makes a good point, that usually fat people in his books are punished. And a lot of the adults, the bad adults, tend to be fat and dirty. And it's very interesting. And so there is that sort of moralizing element. And you can see a lot of those really old-timey school stories in it where, you know, those sort of cautionary tales where this bad little boy who lied and never washed behind his ears is caned by the master, you know, and stuff like that. And this good, clean little boy gets to be head boy. Like, you can kind of see elements of that in his writing as well. So I think it's interesting that he does have happy endings. Like, I know people that didn't want their kids to read these books because they just remember them being so horrible. Like, oh, Matilda's horrible, the parents are horrible. And I'm like, they're horrible right up until the extremely fairy tale-like happy ending.
I
Yeah, that's
think
an
that they
interesting. Go ahead, Natalie. Go.
Oh, well, they all kind of have almost like a satirical, like underbelly kind of to it, where it's saying, oh, well, you know, some schools are really, really bad and there are principals that are bad, or there are some adults who do like abuse their children, and kind of shows that. But at the same time, it's like under the surface. And I mean, there are some really morbid things in his children's books, but he doesn't take it all the way, unlike what he does in some of his adult short stories that, like you said, are a little bit more on the horror kind of things. But because like even the adult short stories, they have a layer of humor laced into it, so it's a little bit easier to swallow.
And hyperbole, because the schools are so bad, the parents are so bad, you're like, okay, this is, you know,
this is a little bit out there.
A kid doesn't need to worry about this happening to them because, you know, there's magic powers or talking animals or something, or so extreme that you're not sort of triggered, or I guess like you're not feeling like too attacked by it, because obviously Matilda is not the story of your life, you know. So you can sympathize with her, but you're not like 100% there like, oh my gosh, this is too horrible to read because I have been put in the chokey, because you haven't.
So I'm trying to think personally, if even his adult, like you were talking about his adult short stories, Natalie, I think of like Lamb to the Slaughter, where the woman gets away with murder, and you think about the story where they're chopping off the people's fingers, and the woman comes in and saves the gambler before they end up chopping off the gambler's fingers, but you find out her fingers have all been chopped off. I mean, that is very heavy, but it still is kind of a happy ending, because our main character gets away with, or avoids the mutilation. I can't think of, I'm trying to think of any stories where there are bad.
Avoids mutilation.
When you avoid mutilation, that's good.
I mean,
it's a happy ending, but it sounds terrible. But
I mean, there is the story of the man who goes to it's like a boarding house or something like that, or a bed and breakfast or something, and this woman is welcoming him in to stay the night or to stay a week or something like that. And he realizes that she's really into taxidermy, and does not realize until it's too late that she is really good at poisoning too. Spoiler alert, I suppose. So I think that's a kind of an unhappy end, but it's just like this twisted, like unexpected.
The Landlady.
Yeah, that one.
Wow.
Yeah, I remember reading that when I was in junior high and being absolutely, because I was like little kid, like I loved Roald Dahl. I read everything, and it was all this like whimsical happiness, everything, and then I got into junior high and I was like, yes, Roald Dahl, let's read it, and I read it and went, that's not right. That's not, I mean, obviously there definitely is Roald Dahl. I mean, it has the same style of writing and the same humor underneath it all, but it definitely is a little bit jarring when you're used to his children's books.
So when you read something like that, Natalie and Jessica, that does veer sharply from what you expect from an author, genres. How do you feel about that?
Oh,
it depends on if I liked it.
That's true.
It you know, I have favorite authors that I'm like, that wasn't my favorite of their book, but I think if I enjoyed it on some level, or admitted like, okay, yeah, that was clever. Like, you know, the first time you read Lamb to the Slaughter and you're like, the hero Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, this woman just murdered her husband and got away with it. Like, Lamb to the Slaughter, I actually was very lucky that it was a teacher in a class. Like, that was our one short story for our short story unit in some English class, because it was her favorite short story. And so I didn't randomly discover it looking for more Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I had a teacher say like, this will blow your minds because it's so different from his other stuff. And
yeah,
it's one of the best. I use it as an example all the time of like, if you want to read a great short story, because I just think it's perfection. It's the length, the pacing, everything is just so tight. It's so perfect. And I think if you've read a lot of his other stuff, you see that there is a mean-spirited, bit to it. And so you can kind of see see that happening, I'm with it. I mean, I've turned off of authors because they basically started writing a whole other genre that was not my bag. But I don't go back and like burn all of their other books. Like, I really love the early Laurel K. Hamilton, the early Anita Blake series, that are like, they're kind of like the Jim Butcher, you know, Harry Dresden. It's urban fantasy. She's like a professional exorcist, and there's vampires and werewolves in the real world type of thing. But she basically started writing them as erotica and started writing another series that's just straight fantasy erotica. And that is not my thing. So I stopped reading the series, but I still have my first few books because they were urban fantasy, which I love. So, you know, I'm willing to flex, but not certain directions with my reading. So if I read a story from someone that I don't like, I'm still okay with that person. Or if it's really different, I'm willing to like see like, okay, what, you know, is there other stuff like this? And maybe I'll like that more or something. So like Royal Jelly is my other favorite of his adult stories. And Royal Jelly is, pardon my French, creepy as hell. It is like actually a horror story. And I would argue that it does not have a happy ending. I guess unless you really like bees. But it is it's creepy, right? You guys know what I'm talking about. You guys have read it. If you have not read Royal Jelly, I do recommend it, but I do recommend that you remember that it's a horror story if you haven't read it.
Well, and he did go on to, I think, speaking of Royal Jelly, he did go on to write for Alfred Hitchcock, Alfred Hitchcock Presents. He wrote, you know, some of these, I can't remember the name of the show that was based on his stuff.
Yeah.
The Unexpected.
He wrote that story Skin, that the guy's back becomes a work of art, the tattoo or whatever it is, and it's at the end of that you're like, oh wow, oh okay, yeah. Like, gross. Kind of like The Landlady, which is also horror. He wrote for a lot of it's sort of like when I found out that Shel Silverstein's original gig was writing for was it Penthouse or Playboy? He was their travel correspondent or something for one of those magazines with Shel Silver, and he also wrote for Nashville. He wrote Boy Named Sue for you know, Johnny Cash.
The song for Johnny Cash.
Yeah, he wrote that. He was a songwriter. He was a songwriter that hung with all those guys, Waylon Jennings and all those guys. He wrote and co-wrote some of their songs long before he ever started writing children's poems and stuff like that. He wrote some really edgy stuff and wrote like basically like traveling as a bachelor looking for love for like either Penthouse or Playboy or something like that. He was their travel correspondent to basically the best bars and stuff like that around the world. Travel correspondent. So, and it's sort of like, oh, that's interesting. What a career change. But so I feel like Roald Dahl's career change was a little more natural. Writing for Alfred Hitchcock seems a little bit more of a normal.
Well, and I didn't realize that he wrote Live and Let Die. He wrote the screenplay for it, right, based on the Ian Fleming book. So he wrote a James Bond movie. He wrote Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. Just
that's
out
great.
Just out of curiosity, as you look at exploring outside of your genre, middle grade YA, how should you do that? Should you do it with a pen name? Should you do it as yourself? What do you guys think?
It's really tricky because on one hand, if you do separate it out into multiple pen names, then you don't have to worry about people who, you know, really like you for sweet romance or middle grade fantasy or whatever, you know, coming and like seeing that you do write other genres and going and reading it and not liking it, you know, because you can say, okay, this is this pen name. And like, you can, as long as like you can keep it open and say, yes, I did write all of these and these are all my pen names. But then it's also hard because then trying to market that is really tricky because you have to market every single individual pen name, and marketing in itself is already hard. So it's kind of a toss up on that. Although there are lots of authors who write lots of different types of genres and are wildly successful, but like, of course, they might be more famous for one type or another. And for instance, Stephen King doesn't just write horror. He writes lots of different genres, romance, Western, sci-fi, he's just really known for horror.
That's a great point, Natalie. Yeah. Jessica, do you have any thoughts on that?
I feel like it's it's hard to keep straight, and it's hard to know how to market and stuff like that. But I think it is a way to signal if stuff is very different. It is a good way to signal to your readers that if they like one thing, they may not like this. Like, you know, J.D. Robb. Everyone knows that's Nora Roberts. So if you pick up a Nora Roberts book, you are getting a romance. If you pick up a J.D. Robb book, you're getting like a procedural thriller. And everyone sort of knows that that's her, but you know what you're getting with that book. So I can see how it's easier to shelve them and stuff like that. But I think the thing that's kind of keeps it, not sure, okay, I don't know. I'm using a lot of air quotes today. Sorry about that. But they're both for adults. Both, you know, Nora Roberts, J.D. Robb, they write for adults. If I were to suddenly write an adult fantasy that was still like not completely R-rated or something, I would probably use my own name because, like, you know, people growing up reading some of my middle grade books would want to then graduate onto my adult book. Great. But if I was going to write erotica or like very gruesome horror, I would definitely do a separate name because I would not want my kid readers who just read my book about this girl and her telepathic horse to like pick up a book and be traumatized for life by reading about someone like dismembering a horse. You know, I don't know, like, you know. So I think like if you're going to really shift genres to a way that I think people would actively hate, or even like if you have kids books and adult books and they are very, very different, I think you maybe should do a different name, even if you're open about it, just so people are clear. I've gotten hate mail for some of my young adult books from moms who read my youngest skewing series, Tuesdays at the Castle. They read Tuesdays at the Castle aloud to their kids and then picked up my werewolf book for older teens, Silver in the Blood, and started reading it aloud to their like 6-year-old. And it's got like these girls in, you know, having to rip off their corsets so they can shapeshift in the middle of the woods and stuff like that. And they're just like, shocking, girls waltzing with young men unchaperoned. And I'm just like, yeah, it's a teen book about werewolves, you know, like, so I think if I went even, and, you know, but still, I mean, I always say my mom's book club loved it and they're very conservative. So, you know, so I feel like if I went even further, I would definitely do a very different name. And, you know, if people were like, is that you? I'd be like, yes, it is. But these are my grown up books. So,
yeah,
I think make that distinction.
Yeah.
I think like
Natalie,
with writing Chitty Chitty Bang Bang is Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, the movie, if you told me Roald Dahl wrote that original story, I would believe you. Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, the book, is a completely different beast. It's so different, has a very Roald Dahl spin. So putting his name on that, like, you should be warned about the child catcher at that point. Like, oh wait, this is a Roald Dahl movie? There's gonna be some creepy guy like attacking children.
my little girl still has nightmares of the child catcher. By the way, she'll come in and say, "I'm so scared of the child catcher."
That was like a bad year for me movie wise. Like my family saw Poltergeist without realizing what it really was, and then we saw Chitty Chitty Bang Bang as a palate cleanser, like for the next family movie. Like I just remember seeing like Jaws, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and Poltergeist like in the same year as a kid, and just I may never go to a movie again. I thought like.
Well, let me ask real quick, and we've only got about 6 minutes left, and I want to be sensitive to your time. How has Roald Dahl influenced your own writing? And Natalie, I'll swing that to you first. How has he influenced your writing?
I mean, I definitely have. I mean, I have my first novel is coming out next month. So I'm a debut author. I don't really know what I'm doing, but does any of us?
What's it called?
It's called Constantine Capers, The Pennington Perplexity, and it's about a detective with short-term memory loss.
Oh, I love it.
So every day he wakes up, can't remember the day before, which is kind of like a whimsical, like you wouldn't really expect that to to happen. And so like there are lots of really ridiculous situations that come out of that. And I feel like in Roald Dahl's works, like that you have the one major like fantastical element that then affects the rest of it. For instance, in The Witches, the child is turned into a mouse, and there are some ridiculous situations that happen just because he is a mouse. And so not that I'm comparing it directly, but some of the way that I phrase things, I mean, I definitely know that I was influenced by it. I don't know if when I'm writing, I am consciously thinking about Roald Dahl in the back of my head, but I do have a morbid sense of humor, and so sometimes that comes out in my writing. But yeah, no, it definitely, I would say that he definitely has influenced me, because it was one of the first, chapter books that I really, I just devoured all of them. So yeah, my book's coming out next month, March 16th. So yeah.
That's awesome.
Go get it, everybody.
I agree. I feel like he kind of made it okay for kids' books to have that morbid sense of humor, which I think a lot of us would cop to if pressed. That, like, and especially as little kids, I always think of The Emperor's New Groove, and he's not a little kid, but when Yzma is talking to Kuzco at the beginning, and all he can think about is that she has like a piece of lettuce between her teeth and her wrinkles. And I feel like a lot of kids, especially when they're being talked down to by adults, even if they're not being like bullied or something, but just, talked literally down to, and you're explaining some great wisdom to them. And I totally don't know anything about this from my own 3 children. Absolutely not. You're, imparting your wisdom, and they are like going like, did you know one of your eyebrows is darker than the other? Because that's all they can think about. And like, I feel like there's a lot of that in Roald Dahl, and it sort of is okay. Like or to have an adult be a very over the top villain in a kid's book and, not have like any redeeming qualities or something, like, but you have to, the whole book has to go along with it. It has to, if you're going to have one kind of madcap thing, like a chocolate factory run by secret little people, then you got to have 4 people crammed in a bed, and dad works at the toothpaste factory, and like all the weird stuff. And I feel like he sort of said, like, that's okay. Like, it's okay to be a little bit scary. It's okay to be a little bit gross. It's okay to have this one kid and everyone else in the book be adults talking down to him. And
it's okay to be absurd.
Yeah, he's letting our freak flag fly there.
Yeah, I like that idea. It's okay to be absurd, whimsical, to have a brown schoolhouse that everybody goes to and everything is brown. That was marvelous. Well, I would say we could open it up for Q&A. I'm not exactly sure how that operates, but
I do have some questions on the chat. We do have
a question from Jen Mirish, who would like you to talk about a little bit about Roald Dahl's autobiographies, if you can.
Actually, have both of them here, Boy and Going Solo, right here. So this one is more about his childhood and growing up when he is
because his mom called him Boy.
School. Yeah. So there are some fantastic little, it's kind of like a combination of lots of tiny little stories, but like they have an overarching narrative, such as the one with the mouse, which is my favorite. And then we have Going Solo, which is more about his time during World War II as a pilot. So I'd say, I think both of them children can read, but they kind of have some more like, I don't know. It's kind of like those children's cartoons where, there's something for the kids, but like if you are an adult, there's kind of the humor that goes over kids' heads a little bit in it. So this kind of reminds you back of when you're a kid and is very nostalgic. And this one's a little bit more like, I don't know. It is talking about the war, but like you said, he talks about it in such an optimistic way.
He does it with great humor, and he spends a lot of time in Africa, like with animals. He talks about how much he loves giraffes, and he would jump out of his car and go walk amongst the giraffes anytime he saw them. But I feel like there is some of the humor I think will be a little bit lost on kids. I don't feel like it's inappropriate, but I don't think that they would see his like jokes about about the war and stuff. I don't know if they would get them. But it's usually packaged with his kids books, like in box sets and stuff. Going Solo. because but Boy is interesting because you can really see where a lot of his stuff from his books came from. There are pranks that he pulls in there, like with the mouse and stuff like that, that are in his books, and his family dynamic and stuff like that is in a lot of his books. And so I think if you're looking for sort of like a key to like what made Roald Dahl tick, like read Boy for sure.
And you can definitely tell that he remembers what it's like to be a kid. Which,
yes.
I mean, you can tell that from reading his books too, like his children's books, but he definitely remembers what it was like, and the dynamics between children and adults and everything.
Wonderful. Well, Natalie Brianne and Jessica DeGeorge, thank you so much. We're at time. This has been delightful to just be together and to talk about this incredible author. Is there just any last minute things you would like to say about maybe upcoming releases? You talked to us briefly about your book that's coming up, right? The Constantine Capers, that will be coming out soon. And Jessica, anything to...
Almost exactly 1 month is your debut?
Yep.
That's so exciting.
We're going to be doing a cover reveal here soon. And I have, I mean, I don't know if this is the right place to say it. I'm doing an online scavenger hunt kind of a thing with riddles and codes to lead up to it. So if anyone's interested in that, go to my website, nataliebrianne.com. There should be information about that in the next week or so. So if you're interested in solving codes and riddles and whatnot,